The campaign for votes for women in Britain in the early years of the 20th century was notable for the intensity of campaigning, plurality of groups involved, and a variety of tactics used by campaigners. The majority of campaigners for votes for women chose non-violent means, such as organising petitions and lobbying politicians. This was the strategy advocated by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, an umbrella group covering many of the organisations that had grown up around Britain during the later 19th century. By 1913, the NUWSS had more than 50,000 members across nearly 450 societies. However, in the early years of the 20th century, some campaigners, frustrated by a lack of progress in achieving electoral equality, adopted more militant tactics, such as disrupting ballots, window breaking, and other attacks on property. The common objective for all groups was equality between men and women in voting rights at parliamentary elections, i.e. elections to the national government. The arguments used by militant and non-militant campaigners alike shared much in common, and both groups were targets for ridicule and more violent oppression by those against votes for women. The arguments in favour reflected wider conceptions of government as securing freedoms or ensuring rights for those governed. These commonly took the form of describing areas of policy relevant to women, focusing on sources of wider inequality in existing legislation. For example, in the regulation of conditions in factories that mainly employed women, and in aspects of family law such as inheritance. Campaigners argued that current legislation in these areas was unfair to women, and that men elected to Parliament would not have sufficient incentive to reform these laws without being answerable to an electorate that included women. These were often very practical arguments that focused on specific issues of the day, and they reflected an instrumental approach to the Votes for Women campaign. Women needed to form part of Parliament's electorate to ensure legislative change in aspects of society and life that directly affected women. In these arguments, however, there appears to be little attempt to question or challenge the views on which areas of life were seen as specifically relating to women. Another common form of argument took a different approach, appealing in a more abstract sense to shared ideals of equality and liberty. The NUWSS pamphlet, 14 Reasons for Supporting Women's Suffrage, listed as its first reason, because it is the foundation of all political liberty that those who obey the law should be able to have a voice in choosing those who make the law. Others referred to women's status as taxpayers, echoing the 18th century American independence cry that taxation without representation was tyranny. Denying the vote to women was demeaning to the status of women, but also it was dangerous to the quality of representation in Parliament, and therefore to the ideals of democracy itself. The immediacy of the threat to democratic ideals was sometimes backed up by a reference to children and the specific role of women as mothers. A 1913 pamphlet from the Women's Social and Political Union argued, "So long as the majority of the women of the country have no interest in politics, the children grow up ignorant of the meaning of the struggle for freedom." The NUWSS put it another way: public-spirited mothers make public-spirited sons. Opponents to women's suffrage countered that political equality was not possible between men and women because there were fundamental differences between the two sexes. Drawing on socially accepted roles of the time, women were portrayed as being naturally suited to the domestic sphere, nurturing children and conserving family life. By contrast, men were portrayed as active and powerful, with a natural interest in the world outside the home and the physical strength to carry out the work necessary to protect the nation and, importantly, the empire. According to theories such as these, votes for women in parliamentary elections would result in two calamities. First, women themselves would become corrupted by being made to act in a way that was against their fundamental nature. Second, nation and empire would be put at risk because Parliament would start making decisions based on the needs of a part of the population who would be incapable of enforcing those decisions. Supporters of Votes for Women strongly rejected such thinking. For more militant groups, women were not only capable of action in support of their aims, they were also morally obliged to act. This obligation to act in defence of liberties and democratic values was used by militants both to justify their campaigns and, at criminal trials, to set out their status as political activists. A typical example was the defence used by Alison Nylands against the charges of criminal damage and assault, which was subsequently published in the 1913 pamphlet Ballot Box Protest. And here she says, "I have been fired by that spirit of liberty which I hope breathes in every man and woman, to commit an offence against what is, as far as women are concerned, a tyrannical and unrepresentative authority." This imperative to act can be seen reflected in the statement of the Women's Party, which was formed in 1918 by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, Annie Kenney and Flora Drummond. The party's programme for the war and after stated, "The internal dangers that threaten the existence of democratic nations at the present time are due to a failure to realise that freedom does not mean the absence of control and discipline, but really means self-control and self-discipline. In the mind of every British man and woman, a sense of national duty and responsibility must go together with a sense of individual political and economic rights." Campaigners for Votes for Women in Britain in the early decades of the 20th century broadly agreed that men and women shared similar democratic aspirations, and crucially shared duties towards the care of liberty in the nation. In these campaigns, the concept of liberty was linked to Parliament and government, through protecting rights and bringing about the conditions by which individual freedoms and equality could be enjoyed. Although opponents tried to demonise campaigners as being deranged, immoral or unnatural women, many of the campaigners themselves emphasised accepted notions of womanhood. In particular, the role of women as mothers and carers for the next generation was used as an argument for the vote. In the later decades of the 20th century, some campaigners for women's rights began to challenge this traditional consensus about the role of women in society. Where the Votes for Women campaign focused attention on Parliament and concepts of liberty, the women's liberation movement campaigners in later years began to focus on gender inequality and its sources in society and culture, including attitudes to family and employment, and the way that women were represented in everyday life. The British Library's website on the women's liberation movement in Britain during the 1970s and 1980s includes interviews with campaigners and other materials that describe women's rights movements during this time. You can find more information here about the sorts of issues that women campaigned on and what motivated women to take part in these campaigns. Next, we'd like you to think about the Votes for Women campaign in the early 20th century and about other women's rights campaigns that you are aware of. How do campaigners express ideas about liberty, freedom and equality? Do these concepts and arguments sometimes conflict with each other? And in the next step, we'll ask you to discuss these ideas and ask whether equality ever comes at a cost to liberty.